Well, Jimmy, hope everybody had a wonderful weekend. So we move through the material we've talked about throughout how the city again kind of creates a certain state of mind, and how the city is used as a landscape to try and capture this ideological essence in many ways. In chapter 7, and make sure that you follow the syllabi, it's not every chapter is assigned. So please make sure again that you look at the chapters that are assigned because they don't always go in order. Um, it talks about how the city again has used art to kind of like capture this imagination as well. And again, I'll leave that up for a couple of moments, and we'll break them down in more detail. As always, make sure that you take notes on the discussion in addition to what you see there on the screen. And I'll use the discussion to fill in some of the gaps in a moment. So get urban images, and we talked about this a little bit before. Keep in mind how these things tie together. We were talking about the section on urban planning and how that dovetails into how cities were designed in a certain way to try and create a certain mindset and physical space that even to use to try and improve the values and morals of the people in the city. So urban planners were very keen and deliberate about how they went about, constructing these spaces through the 20th century. In this way, urban images provide a very strong associations with place. So again, we talked about this before, that if like a ball game or something like that is on, that they'll show like, the urban landscape, different like, architecture and famous sites from that city. When you're watching a film, a lot of times, again, very often, for example, like a show or film might be based in New Orleans, but might not actually be shot there. So, like for example, like I'm sure y'all seen the film. Well, I would imagine definitely your parents have seen the film Soul Food. It was also a TV show um, that they piloted as well. That ran for a few years, and that show was actually, even though it was based in Chicago, it was actually filmed in Toronto. But they would get you in the Chicago mindset. They would show you different like sites and landscape and show you the Chicago skyline. But the rest of the story will be carried on just in these abstract places. And we'll talk about these in more detail in a moment. But you've seen these for yourself. Again, Eiffel Tower in Paris, Big Ben, the big clock in London, the Colosseum in Rome. And art is been very important in capturing the social, political, and economic image of the city. And when we talk about art, again, don't only think about this in the mindset of like Picasso and Monet and cats like that. Although we'll talk about some of that, but even like the most important art form of the late 20th and early 21st century of hip hop music is very much engrossed like in a specificity to an urban environment. That it's not just that No Limit and cats like that were making rap music. They were making rap music that was specific to New Orleans. That Jay-Z's music is very specific to Brooklyn. That Chance the Rapper is very specific to Chicago. So in this way, T.I. in Atlanta, the cats make it a strong point to really like, capture the environment and vibe of their cities in their music. So Paris was one of the first cities where we saw some of this. And again, make sure that you see the connections here in terms of how art is kind of like, used to capture imagination of a city, that these images, we talked about before, that the city is a place of big business, not only just for the Industrial Revolution in terms of like, factory jobs and things like that, but in terms of like driving tourism and, and things of that nature. And the art and artists have played an important role in that regard. Much of this artwork you've undoubtedly seen before, as a lot of these pieces that we'll see in a moment are pretty famous, and that the author features in the text in this chapter. So again, we talked about these shock cities that in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, all these cities were going very rapidly. London, Paris, Berlin, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis. We discussed how, because so many people were coming in such a short amount of time, it required a certain degree of urban planning. In the 20th century, Le Corbusier was very much involved in that process in Paris. And one of the things that it did was like the city, it established the city again as a site, for the bourgeoisie, a term that, you should have heard in principal sociology and in other classes. And again, these are like, the owners of the means of production. So when you had the Industrial Revolution taking place, you had, again, most people that were working in the factories, these were people that were described by Marx as proletariat. The bourgeoisie were the people that owned the factories. So a city like Paris was in many ways designed to kind of suit their needs. The poor and working class communities were, outright demolished or increasingly isolated and marginalized. And again, we see some of this bourgeois, culture in the art of the time. Well, you see here again, like, some famous historical paintings that kind of like, capture the lifestyle and dress of 19th century Paris. We also see art play an important role in New York City. Well, although New York was, a heavily populated city already on the onset of the Industrial Revolution, it really began to take off after that. And there was no place that people flooded to more. This required the development of a well-organized public transportation system. Again, much like we discussed in Chicago, the transportation system that they use today, the foundation of it was created way back when. Much like, again, we saw in Chicago, as more and more people began to crowd into these spaces, housing and places for businesses to operate became a lot more congested and competitive. So it required a greater need to build up. As we discussed, in the very beginning, even talking about the agricultural revolution and the importance of water, even though there was not a lot of farming going on in these places, access to clean water was still crucially important. In fact, probably more so. New York City was not the greatest place in terms of sanitation in this regard. At this, and quite frankly, it still is not the most sanitary city. And I love New York. I'm just saying.
Question, Dr. Muhammad.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're fine. That wouldn't have anything. Just like you said, like dealing with the water, like like, and it's not just New York, but like I've seen it in Philly and Jersey too. Like with the sewer systems, like even though I know like this is kind of like further back, like during the time when they just started transforming, is there something going on like with I guess like the way like the cities are clean, where like animals and different things can be like in the water and stuff, it can be toxic and stuff, or like that would be a little bit different from what you're going at with the water.
No, not at all. These things are still persistent problems and challenges of big cities today. Animals could be the least of it. There could be toxins and chemicals in there, that can literally kill you. So like different poisons. Like, I mean, we saw like, unfortunately, the case in Flint, Michigan, where their water system had got like badly polluted. And there was a case, I believe it was in Newark or either Trenton, New Jersey. I think it was Newark. But yeah, they had a situation like that as well with their water system. So those things are crucially important. What it speaks to more than anything, Charles, how we talked about, like, again with Paris, or like we talked about with Chicago in the last chapter, the last couple of chapters, it is how a lot of times things that affect poor people are oftentimes greatly neglected. That in urban environments, the well-off are taken care of, and the poor and marginalized are often left to fend for themselves. And we'll talk about some of the challenges that rendered, but also some responses to it. And again, some of the responses was the art itself. That the Ashton School, for example, like in New York, as opposed to, again, a lot of like impressionist paintings of the French period of Paris during that time, really reflected, the elite class and experience of the city. The Ashton School made efforts to really reflect the working class experience, much like the hip hop culture, which we'll talk about later in this class. The art depicted a downtrodden experience of, again, one of the things you have to write about is symbolic interactionism. And it just speaks again, like, how individuals interact with the city, but also how the city interacts with the individual. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's a two-way relationship. So in this way, again, the downtrodden are made downtrodden because of the dynamics of the city. But these downtrodden are not just invisible, passive victims of city life. They also shape the city as well. And this is captured in some of the artwork of this period in New York City. Again, make sure that you check out the text. They have a lot of great illustrations of this that really reflect this. For 2 extra credit points today, perhaps you've heard this in criminal justice before. What is the broken windows theory of crime? What is the broken windows theory of crime? That in attempting to explain crime, what is the broken windows theory? And of course, so as of now, Stephen, hopefully you ain't looking at your phone. I can only give you credit. Make sure that you're, we've stated the attendance rules in this class from the beginning, of the need to be on camera and actually in the camera, like not, like me talking and teaching a class like this probably does not make a lot of sense, right?
Yes, sir.
The purpose of the class is to be actually engaged. So being on camera means to actually be on camera. What's the broken windows theory of crime?
Oh, you want us to go in order, or anyone can speak up? Like for I guess like in my personal opinion on how I like would try to break it down, I guess that's trying to say, like, I guess the it's like a visual representation, like I guess a neighborhood, and they assume that crime happens in that area, like for example, like if seeing like graffiti on trains or in the neighborhood, you would think like, oh, it's like thugs in the area, or like you assume that crimes are committed in like this area because of like the way it looks, I guess, in a sense.
Excellent, very good. And that if you let, and then the final point to that, if you do not strongly enforce rules against crimes like graffiti, like in New York, one of the things that would be common, like people would hop over the train turnstile rather than paying the fare. Smoking cigarettes in places where it says no smoking. That if you allow those type of small crimes to persist, then that will allow the big crimes like murder and rape. It will make people assume that if this area is like, looking a certain way, that this is the area where people could just commit crimes willy-nilly. In many ways, like Eric Gardner lost his life based upon this crime because he was arrested or accosted by the police for selling a Lucy cigarette. So in New York City, in most places, again, I'm not a tobacco smoker, but in most places, like, smoking cigarettes is very expensive and very much in big cities. So everything costs a lot in New York City. So a lot of people, as opposed to buying like, a whole box of Newports, they may buy an individual Lucy cigarette. So Eric Gardner was selling Lucy cigarettes that day when the police came in contact with him. And the belief is that if we don't stop the Eric Gardners of the world from selling Lucy cigarettes, then it's going to create all types of problems for the rest of society. Oh, my God. So graffiti in New York City was very much, again, frowned upon when it began to take hold. But for many, again, like, we looked at the Impressionists before, and wonderful, beautiful art. Not mad at it at all. But for a lot of the poor people living in New York City, they weren't going to be able to afford the instruments and tools to be able to do that kind of art. The schools were increasingly bringing music and art programs out of the schools. So a lot of times the only canvas that people had would be public buildings. New York City, really strongly punished this. Philadelphia was a place where they began to really implement this, where as opposed to locking kids up for doing graffiti, they would actually employ them and have them commission them to do jobs where as opposed to we put an advertisement on the side of this school, we're gonna put this great big mural and you and 4 of your friends can get your art supplies and go ahead and go to work. Or we can leave you out to the Philadelphia streets and see what awaits you out there. So it's use of human capital, investing in people in the way that we do with jails and prisons all the time. So again, make sure you see how these things tie together. We're talking about how Philadelphia dealt with this, which is very much different from how New York City did it, which was lock people up and demonize graffiti artists.
Dr. Muhammad, question.
Yes, sir.
Would you say like me, and this is just me reading off of some of the bulletins you have, do you think what Philadelphia proposed as opposed to New York was kind of more beneficial towards like, I guess, like reducing crime, or like, getting a better understanding of why people of those areas or teenagers did what they did? Like, with Philadelphia, like how, or like right here in the bulletins, how you said they provided employment, they had teenagers like teach art, and it kind of minimized the amount of graffiti, or like, they had a better understanding of it. Do you think Philadelphia did a more a more appropriate job of like,
Well, I try and limit my thoughts and beliefs because those aren't very important. I try and engage in facts as often as I can. And the facts are, I can't speak to the specific data of this case, but overwhelmingly, keeping juveniles engaged and busy reduces the juvenile delinquency rate and institutionalization of juveniles a great deal. Whether we're talking about art, sports, or even after school jobs. We also saw similar what they did in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles. And if again, if you haven't had a chance to yet, definitely do yourself a favor and check this out. In the text. And although you're going to be tested on the text, it is totally okay if you want to use some online searches to supplement what you're learning here. Just do not only rely on that. Don't only rely on what you may find online. But particularly with stuff like this, where I think it'll be helpful for you to actually see some of the artwork as well to kind of reinforce what we're discussing here. Some really beautiful artwork. Again, I love that, like in different cities. I like some of the things they've done in Colombia. Whether it be like in 5 Points, some of the graffiti. That blue wall right across, right around the corner from Allen. I think things like that help to beautify the city, and that certainly was the aim here in Los Angeles, where they created the Great Wall of Los Angeles. And this is done again where a lot of times, when you talk about cities and you talk about the history, much like we do with America, a lot of times it's very much whitewashed and you don't see the black and brown contributions of these places. So the artist made sure that was present here. As always, I'm not going to test you very heavily on the dates. I'm not going to test you very heavily on the dates. Do know, again, just, where obviously the Great Wall was located and what the goals were. As Charles had indicated, definitely to try and keep a lot of young men and women away from crime. But also, again, to really recognize the diversity of the city, where a lot of times, the people that have run the cities and been taking care of the cities have been rich white people. And you see an example there of the Great Wall of Los Angeles. I didn't already say the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of Los Angeles, shows this artwork here, and it kind of gives you the timeline of Americana, but visually. We talked about before the Industrial Revolution So again, there are three major revolutions: the agricultural revolution that allowed people to first begin to gather in large urban environments in the first place and finally have a chance to really sit still. The industrial revolution that transformed the way that business was done and made it where farming was no longer quite as profitable. But as Stephen had alluded to last time, more and more of these jobs are leaving places like Detroit. Like Detroit was in many ways built up as a city through the car industry. Ford, General Motors, those are jobs, again, that pay really well. At the beginning of the 20th century, you didn't necessarily have to speak English. You didn't have to have a whole bunch of education. And you could make good money working at a car factory making cars in Detroit. Because it became so much cheaper to pay Chinese, Mexican, and Indian workers than it would those workers in Detroit, Stephen, more and more of those jobs began to leave over time, and Detroit's population began to fall off dramatically. Again, people will go where the jobs are. In the early 20th century, people go into Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland. In the last few decades, a lot more people are going to Phoenix, Houston, Dallas, Atlanta. This is where the job, Silicon Valley. Again, if you want to work in, the tech industry, the Bay Area is where it's at. So when you have all these jobs leaving all at once, it had a huge impact upon the rest of the city and its economy. Again, Detroit used to have a lot of, black middle class families. It's not an accident that Motown emerged out of Detroit, where you had, again, these, black progressive people living there during this period that had enough leisure time and space to be able to focus on their artistic creativity that way. There's a lot of racism in this regard as well, where there's a huge belief that Detroit was allowed to fail in this way because it was a black city. And like many of these cities did, and again, this is really important, and these are the things that you want to make sure that you make note of in addition to what you see on the screen, of the important role that arts have played in the public school system for black and brown people. Where sometimes, okay, maybe you're not as good at math as you like to be. Maybe, you didn't do as good in that science fair, but you can really play the piano, or you can, you really, have some a talent for dance, or you really have a talent for poetry or something. Through arts programs in schools, that allows us to to find a Stevie Wonder, for example. That allows us to be able to tap into a young Jada Pinkett and Tupac, who went to an art school in Baltimore many years ago. That in this way, kids that could be lost on the street that might not have that much interest in school. Again, I would like to think that I was smart. I wasn't that interested in school when I was in my late high school and early college years. So having something in schools that can still keep these kids' attention and not lose them to the streets is really important. But in many of these public schools, particularly when the schools start to when these cities begin to lose money, a lot of funding gets cut for schools. As we talked about before, there's a lot of money all the time for prisons and jails. But when it comes for things that are going to uplift, a lot of things like this, like education, are cut out, and within the educational programs, our artistic programs are cut out as well. And it's had a huge impact upon a city with such a great artistic tradition like Detroit. I'll leave that up for a moment. Are there any questions or comments so far? Can people go where the jobs are, young people? Be mindful of this in your own job pursuits once you graduate. Find out where the jobs are, where the growing economies are, particularly within your discipline and field. Detroit, again, has lost a huge amount of their population. Detroit was once just behind Chicago. It's the fourth largest city in America. Today it is 11th. Through most of the 20th century, late 20th century, it was losing 1,000 residents a month. This is a city that's predominantly Black and poor. There have been whole neighborhoods in Detroit that have been abandoned. When you talk about the broken windows theory, Charles, again, Detroit, where you have dilapidated buildings, literally broken windows in some of those buildings. It communicates for would-be criminals that this is an area where they won't have much disturbance. But there are a lot of beautiful things in Detroit that have been neglected. A lot of really historically important buildings, such as the Detroit Museum, which was built in 1927. So an effort was made to redesign this building, to kind of showcase it as a part of that history, but also as a part of Detroit's future. And it was reborn as the Detroit Institute of Arts. I'm going to get bumped out in a moment. Let's log back in using the same link. I do want to get at least a little bit into the skyscraper, the chapter on skyscrapers today. So let's log back in at 11:40 sharp. Obviously, we won't be very long, but I do want to at least get into this. If you're looking through the syllabus, you'll see I'm a little bit behind, so I'm aiming to get as caught up as quickly as possible this week. Make sure, again, that you all stay on schedule as well. I'll see you in a moment at 11:40 sharp.
Yes, sir.